Hello everybody, and thank you for tuning in to the Liberty Report. With me today is Chris Rosini, our co-host. Chris, good to see you on the program.
It's great to see you, Dr. Paul.
Okay, very good. Want to talk today about the expanding power of the executive branch of government. But I would suspect that our viewers are pretty much aware of the abuse of a strong executive and would agree with us that most of it we could do without. You know, the anarcho-capitalists say, yeah, go down to zero. A few of us are much more reserved about that. Just to get rid of about 90% of it, and we probably could survive. But right now, we're not doing well. You know, government is being run not in the logical process what kids are taught in high school. When they get to go to school, they have their civics lessons, and this is the way laws are made, which is a bunch of nonsense, because it isn't nonsense that maybe legislation could be done the way. The nonsense is that's just not the way it happens. You know, everything changes, you know, for political reasons. I remember early in my political career in Congress, we worked real hard on a financial bill. And then I found out, well, first, before you get it to the floor, I was on the committee, you get the Rules Committee, and the rules get to, you know, at the very last minute, doctor it up and amend it, where days and days were spent, where they can change it in a flash if you happen to be head of the Rules Committee. So it's one of those things. Then if there's a disagreement with the Senate, oh, well, we have to have a conference on this. If it ever gets that far, then they go together and have a conference and rewrite the whole thing again, you know, and I'm overstretching the point, but they can change it a lot, or insert something very small. So the legislation process has failed. I think that's part of our frustration. Spending money is a disaster. There's no restraints at all on that. So it's something that has to be restrained. But I want to talk today, Chris, about, you know, how presidents can do it. What tools do they have? We've talked a lot about the Federal Reserve. We know that they are very, very powerful because they control the monetary system. They print the money and spend it and pass it out. They get involved in overseas activities, and that is very, very powerful. So sometimes the person controlling the monetary strings are really the most powerful. But we've talked about that a whole lot. But what we want to talk about today, because we have a new president, and he's up there busy writing and signing. Every day you see him, he has a stack of stuff he's signing. And these are laws. They call them executive orders, but these are changes in the law. And he's there, and I thought it was very entertaining but scary when he was looking at this thing and he was studying it, and he looked to his aide, and he says, what is this? What's this all about? He didn't know what particular thing he was getting ready to sign because it's so massive. And yet he may be working on a record, but some of our previous presidents, mostly more times than not, they're Democratic liberals who like the use of the executive order. But the executive order is legal if it's doing only those things that is just enforcing or making something work, say in the military. He's writing directions. That's the way I see it. But the executive order is very, very powerful in changing the law. If you look at the administrations, you know, the bureaucracy, there's always rewriting and writing and discontinuing, you know, the regulations. Well, regulations are laws, but nobody in Congress really, they would think you are so far removed and so esoteric and out of it if you suggested, you know, we shouldn't be writing these regulations. Those are laws, and the executive branch is not allowed to do it. Why don't we stop them from doing it? Now, the mood is not quite ready for that. But there are other things that they can do because they can write all kinds of rules and regulations in the monetary system. So it's something that it's really out of control. I believe that even what the courts do. The courts are supposed to, well, do a lot less. Or some people have said that they shouldn't even be the final judgment on legislation. But even on the legislation, the courts rewrite it. You know, Roe versus Wade is a very, very detailed, complicated in one of the most controversial subjects in our history, and it's the final results that we live with now has been written by the Supreme Court. It wasn't meant to be that way, but this is it's a result of a philosophy where the people accepted the fact that big government's always helpful to them. So therefore, the people, when they get upset with something, they're very good, and they let Congress know, and there can be some changes. But most of the time, the people are asking for things, and the congressmen and the congresswomen are compliant, and they just do what they do because they want reelected. But there's no resistance there, and it's just sort of a mood operation. They're in a mood for spending, and just think of when there's an emergency. There's no concern whatsoever about civil liberties. You take the example of 9/11. Just think of how much was done through executive orders. Then all of a sudden, the mood is such under the coronavirus epidemic. Do something, and then who complies in all this? Who stirs up the trouble? The people who are the fear mongers. And believe me, there's a lot of fear mongers. You'll run into them on a daily basis, but they're only reciting what they hear from authorities. Very, very well-paid scientists who know more than anybody else about the coronavirus, and therefore you listen to them, even though every day their message seems to change, and it's back and forth. So there's a lot of activity there, the motivation, but it seems to me like it's so rarely a motivation to move to understanding the restraints placed in the Constitution by the founders. I think they would be aghast, even though they would, I believe, recognize at time a president has to write directions in order to, pursue constitutional functions. But that's not what we're arguing about. We're talking about, runaway government, and the popularity of this is such. It's a saying by Bagala that write a law of the land, sign a piece of paper, law of the land. He thought it was kind of cool. He thought this was neat, and that's how we live. They just write it and they think it's neat. Whoever has the pen, you can imagine how many people are saying that now in the Biden administration when he has a stack legislation. We don't have to deal with that, Congress. We don't have to deal with that. We don't have to deal with paying for this. The Fed will take care of it. It's just whatever their impulse is. So that's where the problem is. A lot of people understand it. Certainly our viewers understand the monstrosity of what we're dealing with, but we still have to do our best to explain why this is not what America was supposed to be all about, and we can and should do something about it.
Right, Dr. Paul. And I looked up who has written the most executive orders, and this is going to shock people, I know. But number one, by far, nobody even comes close, is FDR with 3,728 executive orders. And then right behind him is Woodrow Wilson with 1,803 executive orders. And now we read that President Biden has a record 40 executive orders in 9 days. And the shocking thing is that this is from a party that insufferably lectures the entire country about our democracy and our values and who we are and blah, blah, blah. And like you said, Dr. Paul, it's nothing like what the government schools teach the kids on how a bill becomes a law. Often in reality, Congress, they don't even read what they vote on. Often they can't read what they vote on. There's thousands of pages of legalese, and they're given so many hours, and it's impossible. And they're even told, yeah, you just vote on it first, and then you'll find out what's in it later. So that's what's not taught in the government school books. So we have the executive orders, and like you said, with the courts, they're not the legislative branch, but they're writing laws too. And here's the kicker. Every single person that has done this throughout our history, they get up, they put their hand on a Bible, they raise their other hand, and they swear to uphold the U.S. Constitution. So the whole thing from start to finish is completely backwards.
And it sort of gets to me when we see those people who probably 99% of the time over their career of 10, 20, 30 years disobeyed the Constitution. And then they get up, and when this whole second impeachment came up, because there were some legal questions about that, whether that was really what the founders intended, and they'll march out there, marching over to the Senate and saying, this is our responsibility as members of the House of Representatives. This is very, very serious. It's our responsibility to enforce the law and make sure this man is impeached or doesn't ever have a job again in the world. So that's the kind of thing that's so disgusting, is that they use these terms. And that reminded me of one of these executive orders that Biden has, that he's proposed and signed, yes, is the ethics. This whole thing that, well, if I pass this, everybody's going to be ethical in Congress, and they have pages about what an ethical person does. And you told them what the ethical congressman would do, Chris, when you said they take an oath. Why don't they read the oath? And why don't they do what they swear they'll do? No, we have to have pages and pages. The bureaucrats had to have had written that, and it will have no effect. But Chris, you mentioned a member of, a president that had the most executive orders. I remember, the beginning of the Second World War and the war that went on, and this was something. But there was a time when I was old enough to say, my whole life we've had nobody else except FDR as president. But he was very busy. I don't think they called it the deep state, but there's always been a group of people that does, behind the scenes have a lot of influence. It's usually the moneyed people, and that became much worse once we had a Federal Reserve system and they were able to guide a lot more power. So, but there was somebody giving the influence, and on Roosevelt, of course, it was a depression, which was government and Federal Reserve created. I mean, it was the Federal Reserve that created the bubble in the 20s and created the bust in the 30s, and it was the Congress that decided, well, the best thing we can do is get the price of crops up. That was important. The farmers are having trouble. They need more money for their corn. So they said, well, the supply is too much. People starving in the street. The supplies are too much. So they had this brilliant idea. We'll plow the corn and the other crops under. There'll be shortages, and then prices will go up. Guess what? They just created more people hungry. I mean, that's the insanity of what was going on. But anyway, in 1933, right after Roosevelt was sworn in, he was elected in 32. One of the very, very first things he did, because he announced a banking crisis and the banks were closed, and then they had Executive Order 6102, and it was just a minor little thing, a little tinkering with the money supply, is if you own any gold, turn it in. The government wants your gold. And we'll give you paper money for you. We'll give you $20 an ounce for this, so turn in your gold. And the people did. There was $10,000 fine and imprisonment if you didn't turn it in. So they did this, but the purpose of that, of course, was to try to get people spending money instead of hoarding the money. But that was in 33. It wasn't legal for Americans to own gold until 1975. So it's long lasting. And of course, he did that with the confiscation of gold. But he also did one, not as many people would be aware of this, the WPA workers go out there and pay people to, it used to be said, to stand on a shovel. Anyway, the WPA was to create working jobs that didn't work or didn't have a project. It was non-market oriented. There was no purpose in what they were doing. And that was an executive order. That was in 35, and it was to create jobs. And it didn't work. It cost money. And they didn't allow the correction to occur that needed to be done. They just interfered, and that's why the Depression lasted so long. But the next one I'm going to mention that Roosevelt brought up right after the war started, probably one of the worst things we've done in our history, but there are others pretty bad. And that was the concentration camps here in this country, which involved over 100,000 individuals. Japanese Americans were, well, you're Japanese American. You're a potential terrorist. Let's lock you up. and it was bad. So we complain about what's happening today. Just call you a terrorist. Used to be foreign terrorists. Now there's domestic terrorists, and they arrest you for political correctness and proper speech. But back then, you know, it was pretty darn serious. It was tough surviving it, but we did get by this. Now, right after that, and during that period of time when Truman got us into Korea, not undeclared. It was undeclared. No participation by Congress. So we go to war, but Truman said, "Don't sweat it. It's not a war. It's a police action." Yeah, and like 28,000 or 30,000 Americans died in that war. But he was far from a free market person. So he said that, well, prices are going to go up. We don't want prices to go up. So we should become, like a socialist country. We should own the steel mills, because steel is what we need to win this war. So he put on control. Oh no, he took the steel over, went to the Supreme Court, and this might have been the last time some common sense came out of any of these executive orders. It was ruled unconstitutional, which is pretty good. But most of the time, the courts either expand it or ignore it or distort it. So the courts have not stood up, whether it's on the monetary issue or economic issues or personal civil liberties. The courts haven't been that good. Chris?
Right, Dr. Paul. And I want to make a distinction here because, the optics of executive orders are just bad. One guy just with a stroke of a pen makes a law. But I do want to make a distinction that you can have tyrannical laws with any number, whether it's 1 or 500. I mean, look at the U.S. Congress. They ignore the Constitution every single day, and there's 500 of them. So numbers by themselves do not protect liberty. The only thing that can protect liberty is when the people guard it, cherish it, and guard it jealously. When the politicians think that the people don't care about their liberty, they're going to take it away, and that's exactly what they do. And you know what? The U.S. Constitution was supposed to limit them. You can do this, this, this. There was a Bill of Rights. Don't even think about doing this, or this. It was broken, and over time, it wasn't in one day. It was decade after decade. They would just chip away at that U.S. Constitution. Now we're left with virtually nothing. So liberty, once again, has to be desired by the people that are around, and it will be ultimately, because the road that we're on is only going to get worse and worse until people finally want their liberty again.
If you're an individual, and I don't think many will be listening to our program, says that government is very necessary, and we're having tough times. We're having coronavirus and so many other problems, economic problems. We really, really need the government, and we don't have time for the Congress to pass these things. So they support this, never questioning, how do we get ourselves into this? And so even though I think there's still questions remaining about exactly how the count came out in the last election, Biden is now president, and the system has permitted him to be president, and it's acknowledged that now. And we're talking about executive orders and how generously the administration likes it. Now I think it's 5 sheets of paper I want to put up, mainly because somebody now has compiled all of President Biden's key executive orders in one chart. And that includes some proclamations and mostly executive actions and executive orders. This tells you he's been busy. You got to give him credit. I bet he has a sore wrist. But here it goes. I'm going to just turn these pages over to show you, because these are written on both sides of the paper. All President Biden's key executive orders. There's a whole sheet of paper. There's a sheet there, and both sides there. These are all separate. There's about 8 on each sheet. And here's another sheet full of them. This is just in a few days. No wonder he doesn't know what he's signing. Just somebody behind the scenes sign it and pop it down on a desk and start signing them. But this is also government out of control. Government is unhinged as far as I'm concerned. But Biden had made some other proposals to deal with. The one is the mandatory wearing of masks. We're about at the point now where most people are waking up, especially with kids. They don't work. there's no evidence that the disease has been prevented, because if you compare a state that essentially had no lockdown, no mask, to a state that had very strict masking, take New York, look at the disaster up there. The masks have not done anybody's favor, even though I believe strongly in masks in a medical sense. And this is massive medical interference by non-medical people and trying to deal with sick people. So there's only one answer: everybody wears a mask. And this week, of course, Fauci admitted it. There's a problem out there, although he's a flip-flopper, goes back and forth. Finally, he said, well, it's not working quite well. We need 2 masks. That's going to solve the problem. And then yesterday, I don't believe it, but I read it. It said, somebody came out, he called himself a scientist. He says, I'm not sure that 2-mask business is going to work. We need 4 masks. It's nuts is what it is. And in a free society, in a libertarian society where you have doctor-patient relationships and you permit people to do what they think is best for them, you don't have a rule. You don't say you must wear a mask, you're not allowed to wear a mask, you're not allowed to do it. The business owner, the people who owns houses and anything they own, it would be dealt with properties and voluntarism, and the individual can make the decision. And wow, that is a bold move. And people say, nah, that's too radical. You're going to get your name on the wrong list, and you're going to be canned from being on social media if you keep talking like that and letting people make up their own mind. Anyway, we have the authoritarians out there writing it, but he has another one here that I'm going to talk about a little bit, because it's not so much that the intentions were wrong, and some people are going to be some good. I imagine there'll be some people on viewing, they'll say, no, Ron, you're wrong on this one, and that is the Made in America thing. I like buying in America, and for years I made a big point. It's gotten hard for me to find out which part was made in America, which part wasn't made in America, so it got confusing. But I sort of like the idea. But for a mandate, it's wrong. It's interfering. It doesn't solve the problem. They say, well, we can't compete. Our prices are, are too high, so that's why people are buying overseas. And we certainly don't want people buying anything from China, so we have to stop it. Well, the reason why that doesn't work is the fact that when you force people to buy something overseas, if you can buy a pair of shoes in this country, they're very, very good, and you like them, they cost $100. Sorry. Well, that's one thing. But what if the market is allowed to be much freer, and people have their civil liberties to own the money they earn, and they can spend it the way they want? Well, they might say, oh, I just saw that on a shelf, and it said tennis shoes. They look exactly like what I want. They're only $12. I think I'm going to buy it. But the problem is they were made overseas, and that raises this question. So that should be sorted out by the individuals deciding where they're going to buy it. But I'll tell you what, this is a tough one to convince people, because people say want to punish. But don't be sucked into that, because the people you're punishing are the people who are least able to compensate and pay more for their stuff. And it's wrong. It's wrong with civil liberties. It's your money. You shouldn't be told how you can spend it. It's sort of like, well, if you don't spend it right, when gold was money, he just took the gold from you. It's an attitude of overreach on telling people what to do. So I'm opposed to that, but I wouldn't be surprised if a lot of people will say, hey, no, this is okay. This is the exception that we have to make, because we don't want to subsidize somebody else. But no, you're hurting the very people you're trying to help. All tariffs and everything don't hurt the companies or the countries who have the tariffs placed on them. It doesn't help the relationships. It doesn't make better relationship with allies and all. And they just don't solve the problem. They generally make it much worse. They put on these sanctions. Guess who pays for the tariff? The purchaser here in this country. Because the people who are importing can't sell it to it. They're not going to just take it out of their piggy bank. No, they're going to collect it. It's a natural business activity. Oh, I'm getting charged more to send stuff to America, so prices just went up 10%. So they get their money, and then when they pay, then they send the money to the United States. Here, this is what we owe you for the tariffs. It's distortion. Now, no tariffs, and for foreign policy, for economic policy, for freedom, sanctions are a very, very poor tool. I would say when there's a declared war, reconsider the whole thing. But sanctions, when there is not a declared war and they're put on arbitrarily and carelessly, you're liable to lead the war, is what happens so often. That is the problem. So I am a strong believer that freedom of choice in what you buy domestically or internationally is your business and not the business of the bureaucrats in Washington. Chris?
That's great, Dr. Paul. I'll finish with a quote that encapsulates what you just mentioned and the dominant mentality of America in 2021. And it's from Frederick Bastiat. He said a long time ago, hundreds of years ago, government is the great fiction through which everybody endeavors to live at the expense of everybody else. And boy, do we see that today. And I do want to qualify that because he does say everybody, and there are many, many, I would say tens of millions of Americans that don't want to live at the expense of their neighbors. They just want to be left alone, but they can't be left alone. So we're here to offer the ideas of liberty, which is the exact opposite of the great fiction. Live at the service of others, voluntary interactions with them, not politics. Politics is the game of go, force, and take. And we've had that for over 100 years of just force and take and take. And this is not just the beginning, 2021. This mentality began to dominate about 100, 150 years ago. It's getting old. It's getting stale and decaying. And you can see it in all the major institutions, the decay that has set in. So we're not the only ones, but we're here to offer the other idea of let's live voluntarily with one another and not be at each other's throats trying to take what the other person has. And boy, would this world be a much better place.
Very, very good, Chris. I'm going to mention a couple more of these executive orders that I consider egregious. They're just so bad. This one probably won't get the attention that it deserves, but FEMA was created by Carter by an executive order in 1979, and then it was massively expanded when the Homeland Security incorporated it into it after 9/11, and we have this massive Department of Homeland Security, which is domestic government, and it's very authoritarian, and that someday is going to be recognized as something we have to deal with. The other one, which has been very controversial, the libertarians would support my position, a lot of constitutional conservatives will, a few progressives would, but a lot of conservatives would say, hey, no, what we need is really to punish these people that are threatening our troops overseas. They're the jihadists, and they'll kill our soldiers if we get caught bombing people over there. And that's the Guantanamo Bay. And it was opened by Bush, so that should tip you off about being careful about endorsing that. And then Obama tried to schedule the end of the torture chambers and the principle of the secret prisons. So he wrote an executive order, and it was downsized a little bit, but it never got to the point where it was supposed to be closed never happened. But the executive order still existed from Obama, that was the potential plan, was to diminish its authority and finally eliminate it. Well, when Trump got in office, he didn't want any of that, so he wrote his executive order that made it very clear Guantanamo was to stay open. But the one executive order I want to talk about a little bit is the executive order in 1963, shortly after JFK was killed in Dallas. Because this was obviously a very, very big event, and we had to get to the bottom of it, and all kinds of rumors going around. We need to find the truth about this. So they needed a commission. Back then, I was still in the military. I wasn't too much in understanding commissions and all, but I've come to the conclusions that, wow, there's a commission. They want a commission on coronavirus and things like that. I've come to the conclusion that when you hear the word commission, you better suspect that there may be a cover-up in a commission. And that's certainly what I think was the attempt of the Warren Commission, because it was established, and if you look at the members of that, it was really establishment, a group of people that were to sort out this problem. But the most interesting thing about the commission, the person who was assigned to it, really ran the whole thing, was Allen Dulles. Now, Allen Dulles, if you read the history of this place, very, very instrumental, because he was CIA guy, and he got fired by Kennedy. And that story sounds pretty powerful, and he had an axe to grind. But guess what? He got on the commission. And he more or less ran the commission, and that meant that it was to be nothing more than a cover-up. And to this day, there's still the arguments go on, except for one thing: the number of people in this country, honest Americans who have looked at this and heard it, have become more skeptical every year. People just don't believe. Oh, there was this one shot, the magic bullet did this, bounced around, did all this. People don't believe that anymore. So, but it was all done by executive order. Maybe if they had to pass a provision into Congress and they had a little bit to say about the appointments, something different would have happened. But anyway, executive orders are not the way to go. It's streamlining government. And when government is streamlined, it's bound to accentuate their errors. And that's what we're doing. We're speeding things up. Don't go through the process. Congress is irrelevant, and it really doesn't matter too much what they do or say. And yet, we go through the process, and that's not for me to say there's not some important things to do about it, but it's not doing the job that it was meant to do. And that's the reason that we eventually have to have a revolutionary thinking about, should we think about, in a sense of looking at what the founders have given, what they gave us. And they didn't give us this. They didn't give us this. They didn't give us the way legislation would be passed and the executive orders. That is not what was intended. So, when the people get discouraged, and I get that way too, I look at it and said, just think of what we survived. Some of these executive orders during wartime, all the way back to the Civil War, the executive orders and the things that they did on civil liberties. And World War I was bad for civil liberties. World War II was bad for civil liberties. Look at what happened in Vietnam and Korea. By that time, nobody even thought you had to declare war. Short time after I went into Congrest, that would have been 1976. I was on a radio talk show at night. It was some probably low interest station, and there was the opponent was a Democrat, and we were talking about this issue. And he was very polite and all. He says, "Ron, you should forget about this idea that there has to be a declaration of war," because we had finished the Vietnam War and the Korean War, and I thought that was an important point. But he made it very clear, very politely. He said, "Ron, don't worry about it. There's never going to be another declaration of war. It's totally unnecessary." And when I brought this subject up, when they were going to go to war in the Middle East under Bush, they weren't going to declare it. They wanted to give some vague authority and let Bush do whatever he wanted. So they were ducking the issue. So when I brought it up, there was strong resistance. Nobody supported me. And I had a resolution say, declare war if you want to go to war. And of course, nobody voted for it, including myself, but they wanted to make the point. And the chairman of the committee at that time, he was pretty arrogant. He says, "Congressman Paul," he says, "that part of the Constitution is anachronistic. We don't follow it anymore." And that was a bit of truth. I guess I should have settled down and say, oh, I guess I shouldn't. I guess I should go home if it's this way. But no, I didn't go home because I just solidified my suspicions of what we were really dealing with. And that's it, getting people to understand what our country was all about, understanding what liberty is all about, understanding the basic responsibility of government. The basic responsibility isn't to provide perfect safety. The responsibility of government is to work and strive for liberty as perfectly as you can. It's liberty we want and voluntarism, and let people solve the problems. And believe me, when you follow that through even to foreign policy, you have a lot less war. You end up with a lot more peace and prosperity. I want to thank everybody for tuning in today to the Liberty Report. Please come back soon.